The samurai have taken the stage and are flexing their newfound power out in the provinces. The Fujiwara have reached their peak and are running the show in the capital. But the imperial house is not to be counted out just yet. Join me today as we enter the turbulent final phase of the Heian period and watch as Japan's royal line makes one last push to take back the authority that is rightfully theirs. Is there still room in the government system for a strong and independent monarch? Will ruling from the shadows become a thing of the past? And how will Japan's new class of warrior aristocrats play into all this? All that and more on this 11th episode of Japanese History, the Textbook, right here on the Buyuden Japanese History channel. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Japanese History, the Textbook, the series where we explore Japanese history chronologically using Japanese language educational sources as our guide. I'm excited to announce that I have finally gotten around to acquiring an actual pair of real high school Japanese history textbooks to begin using in this series. As I've introduced many times now, the books I've been using up to this point have all been commercially available educational books, the kind that closely parallel what's in a standard school textbook, but at the end of the day, are still commercial products. These new books, however, are genuine classroom use textbooks approved by Japan's Monbu Kagakusho, the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology. My plan going forward is to now primarily rely on these two new textbooks, using them as a framework for what points we focus on and how we structure our narrative, while using other books and sources specific to each era to flesh out the details. I will of course still be drawing from the sources used in previous videos, but they will be taking a far more supplemental role from here on. Anyway, the specific titles are Koukou Nihonshi B, High School Japanese History B, and Shinsen Nihonshi B, New Selection Japanese History B. If you're wondering what Japanese History B is, it's the standard high school history course which covers the entirety of Japanese history from ancient times all the way up to the modern day. This is in contrast to Japanese History A, which is a course that primarily focuses on early modern and modern history only. As always, if you want to know what exact information sources were used in the video, you can take a look down in the video description. Finally, before we get into the video proper, I want to once again give a big thank you to everyone who has subscribed to the channel. We are getting tantalizingly close to the big 1,000 subscriber mark, and I am extremely grateful to all of you who have hit that subscribe button, liked, commented, and shared to help the channel grow up to the point where it is right now. With your continued support, there is hopefully still a lot more growing left to do. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into what we all came here for. Japanese History, the Textbook, Episode 11, The Heian Period, Part 4. With all the excitement of our battle-oriented previous episode, I won't blame you if you've forgotten some of the main points of the episode before that one, Episode 9. However, I want to stress that the events of those two episodes, 9 and 10, were occurring fairly concurrently to one another, with the Bushi warriors going through their formative years out in the provinces as the northern house of the Fujiwara tightened its stranglehold on the central government in the capital. I want you to recall back to the final minutes of Episode 9, when we met a man named Fujiwara no Yorimichi, the man who built the iconic Byodo-in Temple and served as Japan's regent and de facto ruler for more than 50 years. Yorimichi's tenure as regent is often seen as the peak of the northern Fujiwara house's dominance of the central government, and as you can probably infer from that statement, things began to go downhill for the Fujiwara in the aftermath of this period. While Yorimichi was successful in securing and maintaining his own position in the political world, he failed in what was perhaps his ultimate mission as leader of the northern Fujiwara, producing an imperial grandson. Yorimichi was not nearly as blessed with daughters as his predecessors had been, and he only managed to marry one biological daughter into the imperial line. And to his dismay, the union failed to produce even a single child. As a result, the man who came to the throne in the year 1068, Emperor Gosanjō, was the first emperor in more than a century and a half not to have a mother who was of the northern Fujiwara house. As if to add insult to injury, from the Fujiwara perspective at least, Emperor Gosanjō was 34 years old. By modern standards, this might seem like a suitable age for the ostensible ruler of a country, but it was a good deal older than most of the emperors who had occupied the throne throughout the Fujiwara clan's golden age. To sum everything up, Emperor Gosanjō was neither an immediate relative of the northern Fujiwara, nor was he young enough to be intimidated by or bossed around by them. A set of circumstances bad enough that Fujiwara no Yorimichi, now 76 years old anyway, chose this moment to finally retire from the regent position which he had occupied for half a century. The Fujiwara patriarch had effectively thrown in the towel. Emperor Gosanjō proved to be exactly the kind of leader that Yorimichi had likely feared he would be. A strong-willed and assertive leader who was determined to shake up Heian Japan's political and administrative establishment and leave his own mark on the country's history. His area of primary concern was the ballooning increase of Kishinchike Shoen, or donated land-style private estates, which we discussed in our last episode. The rise to prominence of these privately held, tax-exempt land holdings belonging to the country's highest-ranking aristocrats and large, powerful religious establishments was understandably cutting into the imperial court's traditional income base, and Emperor Gosanjō was determined to give his best effort at righting the issue by issuing a new Shoen reorganization order, the Enkyu no Shoen Seirire. These imperial reorganization orders had been issued before by a number of Gosanjō's predecessors, but their implementation had always been left up to the various provinces' kokushi governors, who, as we have seen many times now, were historically not the most reliable bunch. With the new order, however, Emperor Gosanjō set up a brand new office specifically charged with carrying out his vision, the Kiroku Shoen Kenkeijo, or the Office for the Investigation of Estate Documents. The office was staffed by the emperor's trusted personal confidants, and they set about conducting a thorough sweep of the country's shoen estates, demanding official documentation from both kokushi governors and the estate holders themselves, and discontinuing any estates which didn't meet their strict standards. As an example, the powerful capital-based Iwashimizu Hachimangu Shrine was in possession of 34 shoen estates at the time of the reorganization orders issuing, but when the dust had settled, they were left with only 21, a loss of more than a third of their total land holdings. The Kamakura-era history book Gukansho records that the retired Fujiwara no Yorimichi managed to smooth-talk the emperor into giving his shoen estates a personal exemption from the reorganization order by playing up his 50 years of service to the central government and imperial house. However, other historical documents have shed some doubt on this anecdote, and it seems quite likely that the Fujiwara regent family suffered a not insubstantial financial blow, just like everyone else. The end result of Emperor Gosanjō's reorganization order was that the imperial house had managed to reclaim a large portion of the country's land, and thus revitalize its own economic fortunes. The order had not by any means, however, dealt a death blow to the donated land-style shoen, nor had it intended to. If anything, with its strict and systematic evaluation and regulation of Japan's many private estates, it had proved that they were an accepted and integral part of the country's land system that wasn't going to be going anywhere anytime soon. Unlawful shoen estates had been confiscated, lawful ones had been given the imperial seal of approval, and the boundaries between public and private land had been made official and clear for all to see. Ironically, the public land itself had already come to be managed almost like private territory by the powered-up version of the provincial governor's office, which we saw emerge throughout the previous 2 centuries, the Zuryo Kokushi. This system of land-based rule, predicated on the twin existence of private shoen estates and quote-unquote public government territory, is known in Japanese as the Shoen Koryōsei, the private estate public land system. It is the successor to the Kochiko Minsei, the public land, public people system, engendered by the Taika reforms way back in the Asuka period, and it would remain as the system upon which Japan would operate throughout the remainder of its Middle Ages. Having successfully carried out his shoen reorganization order, reined in the overpowered Fujiwara regent family, and restored the authority of the imperial house, Emperor Gosanjō seemed poised to embark on several more decades of strong and vigorous leadership of the country. In 1073, just 5 years after ascending to the chrysanthemum throne, he passed on the emperorship to his 20-year-old son, Shirakawa, and began making preparations to rule the country as Jōko, retired emperor. He was essentially following in the footsteps of the Fujiwara regent family, in that he was putting his own younger family member on the throne so that he could take on a behind-the-scenes role as kingmaker and political puppet master. However, as they say in Japanese, "Rainen no koto o ieba oni ga warau," demons laugh when you talk of next year. And in an unexpected turn of events, the 39-year-old ex-Emperor Gosanjō took ill and passed away just a few months after his son's coronation. Luckily for the imperial family, the new Emperor Shirakawa was just as eager as his father had been to be the master of his own destiny, and in 1086 he abdicated the throne to pursue the same retired emperor strategy that his father had attempted to put into action. He placed his 8-year-old son on the throne as Emperor Horikawa, securing the primacy of his own personal family line over that of any other imperial relatives, and he set up an organization called the In-no-cho, which would both manage his own household affairs and serve as the apparatus through which he would go on to pull the strings of government. In, by the way, is a Japanese word that originally referred generally to the residence of a retired emperor, but from around this time it came to be used as a byword for the retired emperor himself. For this reason, Shirakawa is referred to in Japanese not only as Shirakawa Jōko, but also often as Shirakawa In, and the style of government which he and his successors carried out, the one in which a retired emperor held the ultimate reins of power in the central government, is known as the insei. It should be noted that Japan's transition into the insei style of government occurred somewhat gradually over the course of Shirakawa's life, with his role as de facto dictator of the country becoming more and more pronounced as time went by. The northern Fujiwara were very much still around, and they actually continued to serve as regents to the sitting emperor, even despite not being directly related to him. The catch was that there would now be an even higher-ranking authority figure above the regent, retired Emperor Shirakawa. There was no written rule, however, that the In, the retired emperor, existed at the top of the political food chain, and as the young Emperor Horikawa grew into adulthood, friction actually began to develop between him and his father, and things potentially could have gone a different direction for the country had Horikawa not unexpectedly passed away of illness at the age of 28. With the emperor's death, the retired Shirakawa placed his 5-year-old grandson on the throne as Emperor Toba, and this is typically recognized as the moment when the insei style of government began in earnest. The insei era lasted for approximately a century and comprises the careers of ex-Emperor Shirakawa, his grandson, the aforementioned Toba, who stepped into Shirakawa's shoes after his own retirement, and Toba's son, Emperor and later ex-Emperor Go-Shirakawa. Their government operated by means of orders issued from either the retired emperor's household agency, the aforementioned In-no-cho, or from the retired emperor himself, which were delivered to the Department of State at the imperial palace compound and carried out from there. Retired Emperor Shirakawa was infamous for how little he cared for established rules and precedents, and his taste in political favorites was likewise uninhibited, with supporters being drawn from all levels of aristocratic society, including many individuals with less exalted family backgrounds. These supporters were known as In no Kinshin, and the retired emperor saw to it that many of them were appointed to provincial governorships which they could then take advantage of to repay his kindness financially. For higher-ranking supporters, allies with truly blue-blooded aristocratic pedigrees, the rulership of entire provinces was handed over, a system known as the Chigyokoku system. This system was partially introduced just as a replacement for aristocratic salaries, which had become difficult to pay with the collapse of the Ritsuryo Law Code's land system, but it allowed the quote-unquote owner of a province to personally choose its governors and become the lone recipient of all taxes collected from said province. Naturally, a number of provinces were designated as the personal possessions of the retired emperor himself, further inflating his massive financial power base. Finally, as if things couldn't get any better, donations of shoen estates also began flooding in to the retired emperor, as provincial landholders all jostled to get into the good graces of Japan's new number one. Another characteristic of the retired emperors of the Insei government era, that is Shirakawa, Toba, and Go-Shirakawa, was the depth of their religious piety. All three men eventually entered the Buddhist priesthood themselves, giving us yet another term to add to the pile of confusing terms we have covered thus far, Hō, the title specifically used to refer to ex-emperors who became priests. Much of the vast wealth which they acquired was used in the conducting of grand Buddhist ceremonies and the building of large and extravagant temples, the most famous of which was probably Shirakawa's Hosshoji, whose 9-story tower stood as something of a symbol for the power of the retired rulers of this era. Another aspect of the three Insei leaders' strong religious faith was their frequent prayer visits to the 3 Kumano shrines of Kii province, the Kumano Hongu Taisha, the Kumano Hayatama Taisha, and the Kumano Nachi Taisha. The shrines were hallowed ground in the eyes of Japanese mountain ascetics, viewed as having a close connection with Gokuraku Jodo, the otherworldly holy land of the Buddhist religion, and it was thought that the more one visited them, the more likely one was to attain salvation after death. Each Insei leader made successively more pilgrimages to the Kumano shrines than the last, with Shirakawa visiting 9 times, Toba visiting 21 times, and Go-Shirakawa visiting a staggering 34 times. The shrines are located more than 150 kilometers away from Kyoto, and the retired emperors typically traveled comfortably with large retinues of servants, aristocratic companions, and bushi guards. So these pilgrimages were representative not only of the ex-monarch's religiosity, but also the depth of their proverbial wallets. Speaking of bushi guards, a final defining characteristic of the Insei period's retired emperors was their heavy reliance on the newly emerging bushi layer of society as both bodyguards and enforcers. As a reminder for anyone who may have missed or forgotten what we spoke about last episode, bushi is a Japanese word that is roughly equivalent to our English use of the word samurai, but it is slightly broader in definition as well as more widely used in the Japanese academic world. During Shirakawa's quote-unquote reign as retired emperor, he established the Hokumen no Bushi, literally the North Side Bushi, a group of warriors who were responsible for guarding his residential compound, but who would also grow to form the backbone of his and his successors' practical military strength. The Hokumen, or North Side part of their name, by the way, refers to the location of their guard station being on the north side of Shirakawa's residence. In addition to their guard duties, one of the prime uses of the Hokumen no Bushi was something akin to riot control against the followers of Japan's great temples, who had grown quite bold and aggressive in their direct challenges to imperial authority by this point in history. The temples of this era had begun to form bands of warrior monks, known in Japanese as sōhei, from a combination of their young, low-ranking members and any opportunistic mercenaries whom they could scoop up, and they would send these bands out to march on Kyoto to make demands against the retired emperors or the imperial court. Two of the biggest offenders in this regard were the Temple of Kofukuji in Nara and the Temple of Enryakuji just outside of Kyoto, which also just happens to be the temple founded back in episode 8 by our old friend Saicho. In addition to the retired emperor, these temples had also become a popular target for shoen land donations, giving them the substantial wealth required to go toe-to-toe with the political powers that be, and their inherent spiritual authority added an extra weight to their demands that no secular power could ever hope to replicate. This spiritual authority was actually represented visually when the warrior monks made their riotous petitions, as they would often carry holy relics with them to literally put the fear of God into the emperor and his bureaucrats. In the case of the monks of Kofukuji, this was a holy tree branch called the Kasuga no Shinboku, and in the case of Enryakuji, it was a mikoshi, a divine palanquin of the sort still seen in many religious festivals in Japan today. If you're wondering what sort of demands these bands of warrior monks were actually making, well, they varied from incident to incident, but they often tended to revolve around sectarian rivalries or unpopular inter-temple personnel changes made by the imperial court. The issues were often solved diplomatically, and warriors such as the retired emperor's Hokumen Nobushi were mobilized not to go out and directly engage in combat with the warrior monks, but rather to act as a deterrent against them entering the city of Kyoto and running amok. Even if the actual threat of violence was relatively low, the warrior monks were enough of a thorn in the side that ex-Emperor Shirakawa once famously remarked, "The only things that I can't control are the water of the Kamo River, the result of a die roll, and the monks of Mount Hiei." Looked at from another angle, this quote also shows just how undisputedly powerful Shirakawa was, in that the Buddhist clergy was the only real challenger to his authority beyond the forces of nature and blind chance. Now that we've established the political and social backdrop for the final century or so of the Heian period, it's time for us to get back into discussing the historical narrative proper. You will recall that we ended our last episode with the tale of the Second Great Bushi War in Japan's northern Tohoku region, the Gosannen Kassen, aka the later 3 Years' War. The nominal victor of this conflict was Minamoto no Yoshiie, leader of one of the main branches of the Seiwa Minamoto clan, and although he was ultimately chastised by the imperial court for his conduct during the war, he would continue to be a dominant presence in Japan throughout the last decades of the 11th century. Yoshiie's relations with retired Emperor Shirakawa and the Kyoto aristocracy were rocky due to his tendencies towards belligerency and headstrongness, but he managed to preserve his reputation enough that in 1098 he was given a prestigious elevation in court rank and permitted access to the retired emperor's personal living quarters. This privilege, known as shoden, was extremely rare, typically reserved only for extremely high-ranking nobles like the northern Fujiwara, and Yoshiie was the first bushi upon whom such an honor had ever been bestowed. Nevertheless, Yoshiie's story was not destined to end happily, because just 3 years later, in 1101, his eldest son and heir, Minamoto no Yoshichika, would place an indelible stain on the family name. Yoshichika was ostensibly serving as governor of the island province of Tsushima, but for whatever reason, he led his followers to ransack various parts of Kyushu, killing peasants and seizing local tax products for his own. In response to this traitorous and blatantly illegal behavior, the imperial court ordered that Yoshichika be subjugated militarily, and they chose, naturally, to delegate this honor to the #1 bushi in the country, Yoshichika's own father, Yoshiie. Bringing Yoshichika to heel, however, proved more challenging than expected, and things only grew worse when, right around the same time, a military struggle broke out between Yoshiie's younger brother and one of his other sons in Hitachi province. In the midst of desperately trying to settle both of these conflicts and save the sinking ship that was his family, the wearied Yoshiie's body at last gave out on him, and he drew his final breath in Kyoto at the age of 68. The year was 1106. With Yoshiie dead and his surviving family members at each other's throats, the imperial court this time turned to Japan's other great bushi clan, the Ise Taira, to pick up where Yoshiie had left off and complete the subjugation of Yoshichika out west. The man they chose for the job was Taira no Masamori, governor of Inaba province, and great-grandson of Taira no Sadamori, the hero of the rebellion of Taira no Masakato. Masamori was the leader of the preeminent line of the Ise Taira, a line more specifically known as the Ise Heishi or the Ise Taira, but for the last century or so, his clan had found themselves playing a perpetual second fiddle to the Seiwa Minamoto, and being generally regarded as the absolute bottom rung of aristocratic society. Masamori, however, had begun laying the groundwork for his clan's comeback a few years earlier, donating land to a temple dedicated to ex-Emperor Shirakawa's beloved deceased daughter, and being rewarded with entry into the aforementioned Hokumen Nobushi Guard Corps. Upon being appointed as the new man in charge of subduing Minamoto no Yoshichika, he immediately got to work, and within the span of just a month, he had killed Yoshichika and put the entire disturbance to rest. The entire affair was actually resolved so quickly that rumors would persist for some time that Yoshichika was actually still alive, and a number of pretenders came forth claiming to be him. Either way, Masamori was rewarded handsomely for his efforts, and he went on to be appointed Zuryo Kokushi governor of a number of extremely wealthy provinces, and eventually be rewarded with a court rank nearly as high as the late Minamoto no Yoshiie's had been. When Masamori passed away in 1121, leadership of his branch of the Taira was passed on to his 25-year-old son, Taira no Tadamori, who had already distinguished himself through various military and law enforcement endeavors, and was at the time serving as governor of Echizen province. Tadamori had built up a strong relationship with ex-Emperor Shirakawa, having received the shoden privilege of access to his personal quarters the previous year, and after taking over leadership of the Ise Taira, he worked hard to establish a foothold for himself in the upper echelons of aristocratic society. When Shirakawa died at the age of 77 in 1121, the ex-Emperor Toba took over as the new power behind the imperial throne, and Tadamori wasted no time ingratiating himself to Japan's new leader. He mobilized his family wealth to finance the building of a large temple which Toba had ordered constructed, and was rewarded for his efforts by becoming the first bushi to receive the privilege of Nai Shoden, access to the personal living quarters not of the retired emperor, but of the sitting emperor himself. This honor placed Tadamori in truly rarefied air, and it is no coincidence that the Heike Monogatari, the epic tale of the later Genpei War, which is sometimes spoken of as Japan's version of the Iliad, defines this episode as the starting point for the Ise Taira clan's rise to glory. A few years later, in 1135, Tadamori would be tasked with flexing his warrior prowess to subdue pirates operating in the Seto Inland Sea. Interestingly, the other possible candidate considered for this position was Minamoto no Yoshie's grandson, Tameyoshi, and the fact that the appointment ultimately went to Tadamori rather than Tameyoshi is a good indicator of how greatly the tables had turned in the Taira-Minamoto power balance. Tadamori escorted some 70 captured pirates back to Kyoto in the summer of that year, to much acclaim from the city's denizens. But beyond just succeeding in his mission, he had also managed to forge a number of personal bonds with the local power holders, legitimate and otherwise, around the inland sea. This would be a major step forward for Tadamori and his clan, and the reason can be traced all the way back to the time of our old friend Sugawara no Michizane, whom we met in episode 8. You will recall that in 894, Michizane convinced then Emperor Uda to end Japan's practice of sending the Kentoshi embassies to China, and the result of this decision was that, ever since, no official trade relations had existed between the two countries. Of course, just because it didn't exist officially doesn't mean that trade wasn't going on, and indeed a burgeoning civilian-led trade industry had cropped up to replace the old state-led system. The existence of this prosperous civilian trade is the exact reason why the Seto Inland Sea was having pirate problems, and by being tasked with resolving those problems, Taira no Tadamori was given the perfect opportunity to step in and get involved in the industry itself. Coincidentally, Tadamori also happened to be in charge of managing the Shoen estate in Kyushu, which included the bustling port city of Hakata, and he used this, along with his newly fortified presence in the inland sea, to begin building a massive fortune based on trade with Song dynasty merchants. When Tadamori eventually passed away in 1153, this wealth and status as lord of the Western Sea was inherited by his son, the man who would go on to take the Ise Taira clan to the absolute height of their glory, the legendary Taira no Kiyomori. To trace Kiyomori's rise to the top, we must now turn our eyes back to the insei government of retired emperors, which was at this time being led by the aforementioned ex-emperor Toba. When Toba had himself vacated the imperial throne way back in 1123, the government was still very much in the hands of the previous insei leader, Toba's grandfather, ex-emperor Shirakawa, and Shirakawa saw to it that Toba's son sat on the throne next as Emperor Sutoku. One might expect Toba to be happy that his son had succeeded him on the chrysanthemum throne, but you see, there was this nasty little rumor going around that Sutoku was not really Toba's biological son, but that he was actually the illicit love child of Toba's empress consort and good old grandpa Shirakawa. According to one historical source, Toba had even taken to calling his quote-unquote son by the derisive nickname Ojiko, a combination of the Japanese words oji meaning uncle and ko meaning child, giving us something along the lines of uncle boy or uncle kid. Once Shirakawa was dead and Toba had taken over de facto control of the government, he was eager to get Sutoku off of the throne, and almost as soon as he managed to produce a son that was more verifiably his, he did just this, replacing Sutoku in 1142 with the 3-year-old Emperor Konoe. When Konoe in turn passed away of illness at the tender age of 16, Toba replaced him with a final son, who came to the throne in 1155 as Emperor Go-Shirakawa, the man who, as mentioned earlier, would eventually go on to be the final leader of the insei government. The crucial thing here is that ex-Emperor Sutoku had his own teenage son at this point, and Toba's choice to pass over the boy for yet another of his own sons was a slap in the face to Sutoku, which clearly sent the message, your bloodline is never getting back on this throne. This set the stage for a smoldering animosity between ex-Emperor Sutoku and the new Emperor Go-Shirakawa, and this animosity would explode into open hostility when the restraining force that was ex-Emperor Toba passed away the following year. The resulting conflict is remembered to history as the Hōgen no Ran, or the Hōgen disturbance. Within days after Toba's death, both imperial brothers had begun amassing bushi allies, and it was becoming clear that a military clash was likely on the horizon. The Fujiwara regent family had also split down the middle between Sutoku and Go-Shirakawa, as they too were experiencing their own vicious family feud born out of the complex political situation of the last few years. The preeminent warriors of the Seiwa Minamoto and Kanmu Taira lineages thus began selecting whom to support, based on their allegiances and personal relationships with the various imperial and Fujiwara actors on either side of the conflict. The new leader of the Ise Taira, the aforementioned Kiyomori, ultimately decided to throw his chips in with the side of the sitting emperor, Go-Shirakawa, but the Taira were by no means united, as Kiyomori's uncle would end up pledging his sword to the cause of Sutoku. The Seiwa Minamoto were likewise divided, with the 60-year-old clan patriarch Tameyoshi being won over to Sutoku's side, but Tameyoshi's eldest living son and heir, Minamoto no Yoshitomo, joining the Go-Shirakawa camp due to his personal allegiance to the deceased Toba. The warriors and supporters of each faction assembled at their respective royal figureheads' residence, and in the early hours of July 11th, 1156, events at last began to accelerate toward a climax. On the ex-Emperor Sutoku side, Tameyoshi's eighth son, Minamoto no Tametomo, who had followed his father into allying with the retired emperor, suggested that their forces launch a sneak attack on Emperor Goshirakawa's residence under cover of nightfall. Goshirakawa was, by the way, at this time residing in a building called the Takamatsu Dono, which was, of all things, the former residence of our old friend Minamoto no Takaakira, the ex-imperial family member and politician who was disgraced during the Anna incident of 969. In the late Heian period, the official imperial palace burned down so many times that it became more common for emperors to just find other aristocratic residences in the capital to convert into temporary palaces, which were called Sato Dairi, and this happened to be the exact situation Emperor Goshirakawa was in at the time of his clash with Sutoku. Anyway, Sutoku's main Fujiwara advisor dismissed the plan to sneak attack the Takamatsu Dono residence as a cowardly move, but little did he know that across town, Emperor Goshirakawa's Bushi allies, Taira no Kiyomori and Minamoto no Yoshitomo, were formulating the exact same plan. In their case, the lead Fujiwara advisor to Emperor Goshirakawa gave the plan the green light, and so the combined forces of Kiyomori, Yoshitomo, and their associates armed themselves and set out for Sutoku's residence right around daybreak. The details of the battle which ensued are somewhat unclear, as historical accounts of the matter offer differing details. The Hōgen Monogatari, an epic recounting of the conflict likely composed within a century or so of its actual occurrence, describes a grand siege of Sutoku's residence in which dozens of warriors fell to the near superhuman prowess of Minamoto no Tametomo's archery skills. Actual diary accounts from individuals living at the time, however, indicate that the whole thing was a rather restrained affair, with virtually no major casualties being taken on either side, a point which would make sense considering that Goshirakawa's warriors likely wanted to avoid actually harming the ex-emperor Sutoku. A royal is still a royal after all. Either way, the battle ended around 8 o'clock in the morning when Goshirakawa's forces managed to secure victory by setting fire to the residence, forcing Sutoku and his allies to flee the premises and ultimately scatter throughout Kyoto, although they were all eventually rounded up and arrested. Small scale though it may have been, it was the first battle to have ever taken place within the city limits of the capital itself, marking a significant turning point in Japanese history. The treatment of the defeated Sutoku and his supporters was particularly severe, with Sutoku himself being exiled to the far-off Sanuki province in Shikoku, the first instance of an emperor or former emperor being exiled in nearly 400 years. His Bushi followers were punished even more harshly, with the two Minamoto and Taira chieftains who fought for him being put to the sword in the first state-ordered executions since the Cusco incident in 810. Not only that, but these executions were ordered to be carried out by the leaders of the Taira and Minamoto on the winning side of the conflict, meaning that Taira no Kiyomori oversaw the execution of his own uncle, and Minamoto no Yoshitomo was forced to carry out the execution of his own father. On a slightly more positive note, however, the crucial role which Kiyomori, Yoshitomo, and their Bushi associates had played in resolving this imperial power struggle greatly raised their status and importance in the political world. And it is no coincidence that a near-contemporary history chronicle, the Gukansho, describes the Hōgen disturbance as the dawn of the Age of the Warrior. Ex-Emperor Sutoku, by the way, would pass away in exile less than a decade later, and after his death he became greatly feared as an evil spirit, to the point that he is remembered as one of Japan's Sandai Onryo, the three great vengeful ghosts, along with Sugawara no Michizane and Taira no Masakado. In the aftermath of the Hōgen disturbance, the Fujiwara regent family's political power took a nosedive, and while they and their regent position continued to exist, they were effectively replaced in duty by the close personal associates of Emperor Goshirakawa. 2 years after the disturbance's conclusion, Goshirakawa abdicated the throne to his son Morihito, who became Emperor Nijo, and it is recorded that the Kanpaku regent at the time, Fujiwara no Tadamichi, was completely uninvolved in this decision. Shortly thereafter, Tadamichi would actually pass on the Kanpaku position to his 16-year-old son, an indicator that the office of regent was quickly going the way of the office of emperor, and transforming into a job that looked great on paper but had little real substance. With ex-Emperor Goshirakawa now set up as the power behind the throne and the new leader of the Insei government, the actual reins of government came to be held by his close advisor, the monk Shinzei. Shinzei was a member of a lesser branch of the Fujiwara clan, who had risen to prominence under the late Emperor Toba thanks to his reputation as a sharp intellectual and the fact that his second wife had formerly served as a young Goshirakawa's wet nurse. Throughout much of Japanese history, being closely connected to a powerful person's wet nurse was actually a very reliable fast track to the halls of power, and I suspect we will see it pop up again in future episodes. Anyway, with the now retired Goshirakawa's blessing, Shinzei took charge of a new set of political reforms known as the Hōgen no Shinsei, which focused on, among other things, reorganizing the country's shoen estates and cracking down on the militaristic elements of powerful temples and shrines. The greatest characteristic of the reforms was the phrasing of the reform order itself, which emphasized the idea of the emperor, or rather the patriarch of the imperial family, being an absolute monarchical presence to whom all lands, people, and institutions in the country rightfully belonged. In an age where the position of emperor was fast becoming irrelevant as an actual political office, and more powerful non-imperial entities such as the Buddhist clergy and the Bushi warriors were popping up to serve as influential forces in society, it was crucial for the imperial family to establish its identity as a sort of transcendent philosophical pillar of authority to which all other groups were fundamentally subservient in a cosmic sense. This style of thought, known as Odo Omin Shiso, would form an important basis for how the emperor would go on to be conceptualized as Japan moved deeper into its Middle Ages. As arguably the top policy maker in the imperial court, Shinzei was naturally not without his detractors, and the foremost of these political opponents was without a doubt one Fujiwara no Nobuyori. Nobuyori, like Shinzei, also hailed from a non-regent branch of the Fujiwara clan, and his influence in court likewise came not so much from his bloodline than from he and his family's service to the retired emperors of the Insei government. Nobuyori was a particular favorite of the current Insei leader, Go-Shirakawa, who had put him on the fast track to success and granted him a series of rapid-fire promotions to an extremely high level despite his relatively young age. The cause of the animosity between Nobuyori and Shinzei remains somewhat shrouded in mystery, but it is suspected that Shinzei tried to halt Nobuyori's meteoric rise to the upper echelons of the imperial court, and thus earned his ire in the process. Either way, at the tail end of 1159, Nobuyori decided it was time to eliminate his political adversary forcibly, and he enlisted Minamoto no Yoshitomo and his Bushi warriors to serve as his sword arm in the endeavor. The events which ensued mark the beginning of an incident known as the Heiji no Ran, or the Heiji Disturbance. The two men began their coup d'etat by surrounding the Sanjo Karasuma Dono, ex-Emperor Go-Shirakawa's residence and government headquarters, with the goal of capturing Go-Shirakawa himself and killing Shinzei and his sons, who were expected to be there serving the retired emperor. They did manage to secure Go-Shirakawa, but they also ended up setting fire to the residence, which ironically created enough chaos for Shinzei's sons to temporarily escape, although they were rounded up and arrested the next day. Shinzei himself seems to have been tipped off about the attack in advance, and he was nowhere to be found when Nobuyori and his Minamoto army made their move, instead having already fled the city. 4 days later, however, Nobuyori's underlings caught up with him, and hearing their approach, he took his own life in despair. Back in Kyoto, Nobuyori had Go-Shirakawa moved to the Daidairi Imperial Palace complex, where sitting ruler Emperor Nijo also happened to be living at the time, and with the two emperors now safely in his custody, it seemed that he had created an unassailable position of power for himself. In the aftermath of the coup's success, Nobuyori rewarded Minamoto no Yoshitomo for his service by elevating his court rank and appointing him to the governorship of Harima province, widely regarded as one of, if not the most lucrative and prestigious governor positions in the country. Now, you may be wondering, what was our other hero of the Hōgen disturbance, Taira no Kiyomori, doing while all this was going on? Well, at the time of Nobuyori and Yoshitomo's attack on Go-Shirakawa's residence, Kiyomori was on a religious pilgrimage to the Kumano shrines, the ones which I mentioned earlier were so popular with the retired emperors during this period. And when he heard the news of what had happened, he rushed back to Kyoto. Kiyomori was tied to both Nobuyori and to Shinzei by marriage, having one daughter each married to the sons of both men. And this awkward political position is likely why Nobuyori turned to Yoshitomo rather than Kiyomori for military aid and chose to launch the coup while Kiyomori was out of town. Upon returning to Kyoto, Kiyomori actually initially indicated a desire to pledge his allegiance to Nobuyori. Shinzei was, after all, already dead at this point. But things changed when a group of high-ranking Kugyo aristocrats unexpectedly came to him begging him to fight back. You see, Shinzei had been quite well-liked in aristocratic society. He was clever and competent, he had been serving in government since the days of Toba, and more than anything, he had moved up the promotional ladder at a nice, slow, reasonable pace. In contrast, Fujiwara no Nobuyori was still in his late 20s, an up-jumped whippersnapper who had essentially cut in line on his way to the top thanks to the unfair patronage of the retired emperor. Kiyomori ultimately decided to take up the anti-Nobuyori cause, a decision quite possibly influenced by personal friction between him and Minamoto no Yoshitomo, and together he and the aristocrats worked out a plan to get Emperor Nijo out of the palace complex and into Kiyomori's residence at Rokuhara, a neighborhood on the eastern outskirts of Kyoto. The plan was carried out successfully, with Nijo allegedly making his escape in women's clothing disguised as a female, and at roughly the same time, ex-Emperor Go-Shirakawa also made his way out of the Daidairi, taking sanctuary at the temple of Ninnaji, and essentially expressing his neutrality in regards to the whole affair. It is unverifiable by the historical record, but many mysterious factors throughout the Heiji disturbance point to Go-Shirakawa having actually been the orchestrator of the whole thing, guiding Nobuyori from behind the scenes, and the fact that he left the Daidairi of his own accord and then headed to Ninnaji Temple rather than Kiyomori's residence at Rokuhara certainly points to this being plausible. As to why he would do this? Well, we can make a whole other video on that, but just remember that Shinzei was an old guard advisor who was a holdover from his father Toba's regime, while Nobuyori was a newer face whom Go-Shirakawa had groomed himself. Getting rid of the former and replacing him with the latter could potentially allow Go-Shirakawa to free himself from the shadow of his late father and exercise his will more freely upon the imperial court. With the two emperors having escaped from their custody, Nobuyori and Yoshitomo seem to have realized that the jig was up. Losing the emperors meant that they had lost their symbols of legitimacy, and the narrative would now be rewritten to paint them as the villains and traitors. For Yoshitomo, being a man of the sword meant that his fate would, like his father before him, almost certainly be execution, and so he chose to lead his warriors out against Kiyomori in a sort of heroic last stand. The Minamoto army is said to have fought quite fiercely, managing to make it all the way to Rokuhara and even forcing Kiyomori himself to take up arms before they were finally overwhelmed by the superior numbers of their Taira enemy. Yoshitomo seems to have had a last-minute change of heart here, and rather than die heroically in battle, he chose to gather his 3 sons and head east toward the Kanto region, where he hoped he could lick his wounds and prepare to make a comeback at some point down the line. Unfortunately, these plans would never see fruition, as while stopped over in Owari province, he was betrayed by one of his followers, who murdered him while he was bathing. Of his 3 sons who had fled with him, the eldest returned to Kyoto to attempt revenge, but was captured and executed, and the second eldest died as the result of an untreated wound which he had suffered during their initial escape from the city. Only the youngest son, the approximately 12-year-old Yoritomo, managed to survive the whole affair, and without spoiling our next episode, his survival here would end up having a, rather large impact on the rest of Japanese history. Yoshitomo was also survived by a few other children born to him by his sokushitsu, his concubines or sidewives, but we will discuss their existence on our next episode. As for the other ringleader of the Heiji disturbance, Fujiwara no Nobuyori, he fled to the same Ninnaji temple where Go-Shirakawa had been taking refuge, and there he quietly allowed himself to be arrested. He likely expected that, as a bureaucrat and man of letters, he would be allowed to, at the very least, keep his head and get off easy with an exile or something, but sadly for him, this assumption proved incorrect. That very same day, without even so much as being taken in for questioning, Nobuyori was executed as a traitor against the imperial house, and that is how he continues to be remembered in the mainstream narrative even today. When the dust had settled after the Heiji disturbance, Taira no Kiyomori essentially remained as the last man standing. Ex-Emperor Go-Shirakawa's 2 top advisors, Shinzei and Fujiwara no Nobuyori, were both dead, and Kiyomori's primary rival in the military sphere, Minamoto no Yoshitomo, had been eliminated as well. Thanks to the acclaim he had won from the imperial court for saving them from Nobuyori, as well as the massive amount of wealth and prestige he had accumulated through various governorships and his maritime trade operations out in the western provinces, Kiyomori had reached a level of power never before seen within the Bushi warrior stratum of society. Moreover, he had proved to the imperial court and aristocracy through the Hōgen and Heiji Disturbances that their entire institution was nothing but a glorified live-action role-playing game if it wasn't supported by him and his band of horse-riding, bow-slinging ruffians. Less than a year after the Heiji disturbance, Kiyomori rose high enough in court rank to become a member of the Kugyo, the highest level of Japanese aristocracy, which was allowed to participate directly in the decision-making affairs of government. He continued this trajectory over the next several years, climbing up the political ladder through various top-tier government positions until, in 1167, he was at last appointed Daijō Daijin, Chancellor of the Realm, the highest position in Japan's Ritsuryo law code-based government. A lowly Bushi chieftain, a man who was supposed to occupy the bottom rung of aristocratic society and carry out the dirty work of his social betters, had blown past them all to stand at the absolute summit of power. His ambition, however, was far from sated, and just 3 months after his appointment, he would retire from the office of Chancellor to begin putting even grander plans in motion. Plans which are going to have to wait till next time. Kiyomori's meteoric rise to the top of Japanese society had brought him an unprecedented amount of power, but as any challenge to the status quo is liable to do, it had also made him his fair share of enemies. And on our next episode, we will look at the ultimate result of this mounting societal friction, the Jisho Jue no Ran, better known as the Genpei War. Now, like many other military events, the Genpei War itself is not covered very extensively in school history textbooks, as the details of its semi-legendary narrative are not really all that historically important compared to the massive changes to Japan's society and government that it brought about. Despite this, it's one of those events that, as a history fan, is a bit hard to just whiz by, so my current plan is to devote the entirety of the next episode to it, and then move on to the Kamakura period in the following episode. I guess we can consider it to be a kind of prototype deep dive episode, although I expect I'll be telling the narrative pretty traditionally. Anyway, stay tuned for that, and as usual, keep watching to the end if you want to see a Japanese mnemonic for remembering one of the events of this episode. Until next time, thanks for watching, have a great day, and...